Today is the first day in a series over the summer on the book and story of Exodus. My colleague Lisa found a wonderful Sunday school curriculum about the Exodus, and so it's my intention for the summer sermons to reflect on the passage that the children will be studying in Sunday school. The Exodus is a wonderfully important story, one of the most important episodes in the whole grand story of the Bible. It's that moment when God led the Hebrew people out of their slavery in Egypt, and they were in that moment formed into a people who were God's people and who were to carry on God's mission in the world. And so much of the rest of the biblical narrative flows from that very important moment. And throughout the rest of Scripture, we find God's people reflecting back on that defining moment where God rescued them from their slavery. It's amazing to think how the movement of God's salvation begins with a group of slaves living in a foreign land. To remember how the Hebrews came to be in Egypt, we must think back to the story of Joseph, which is told in the book of Genesis. Joseph was the youngest of Jacob's sons. Joseph was a very precocious young man, and he was his father's favorite. Joseph's older brothers grew jealous of him, and in fact, they hated him. One day they were out in the fields and they decided to beat up their younger brother and sell him to a group of slave traders. Later that day they took home his special coat that his father had given him and said, "All we have left is Joseph's coat, for he was attacked and killed by a wild animal." Well, those slave traders took Joseph into Egypt, where he was sold as a slave. Over a period of many years and through a series of remarkable events, Joseph went from being a slave to a prisoner to becoming an important official in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And in fact, Joseph was so important, the Pharaoh set him as a manager over all of the resources of the kingdom. Joseph became, in effect, the finance minister of Egypt. After Joseph had been in Egypt for many years, there was a famine all throughout that part of the world. And in the part of the world where Joseph's family lived, there was no food at all. But they heard that there was food in Egypt. And in fact, there was food in Egypt because of Joseph's wise management. And so one day, Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt after having not seen their brother whom they had sold into slavery many years earlier. Joseph eventually revealed his identity to his brothers and took them and all of their families under his care and protection. And Joseph said famously to those brothers, "What you did those years ago, you meant for evil, but God meant it for good." The book of Exodus begins then by telling us that the descendants of Jacob and Joseph and all his brothers, the Hebrew people, were living in Egypt, and decades later there came along a new Pharaoh, a new king, who did not remember Joseph and who did not know who these foreigners were or why they were there. And so he decided to enslave them, that they might become the labor force of the Egyptian kingdom. I don't know about you, but this sounds to me a very strange way for God to be at work in the world. And yet we find through the history of the Bible and in the history of the human race and in our own lives, sometimes there are things which happen which have a purpose we do not understand. remember back many years ago when I was what the church calls a candidate for the ministry. And as I had finished my studies in university and my training for this line of work, I became a candidate for the ministry. And I had to do all kinds of things for the church in order to satisfy them that I was suitable to be a minister. And I remember going through all kinds of interviews and having to fill out an incredible number of forms. And I discovered at that time that the church operates about as efficiently as the Soviet Union. And I remember one of the worst experiences I had in my entire life came when there was a particular form that I needed to sign to go through to the very final step in the ordination process and to have a final interview. And there was this fellow who needed to sign this form, and I could never get a hold of him. He wouldn't return my calls, and the deadline passed for having to turn in the form, and because of all this, I had my ordination delayed by an entire year, just because this person couldn't be bothered to meet up with me and sign a form. And I was so upset about it at the time. I just could not believe that this kind of thing was allowed to happen. Well, without going into too many gory details, it would be fair to say that had my ordination not been delayed by a year, I would not have been able to go to the last church that I was serving, which was a really positive experience. And had I not been at the last church I was serving, I might not have been able to come to this church. And even though it was a very difficult experience, and even though it didn't make any sense to me at the time, I can look back on it and see somehow God was at work in spite of it all. And God was at work in ways that I couldn't understand. And we all go through times like this in our lives. Often more than once. We go through something which is very painful, something which just doesn't make any sense. But something not making sense to us is not a sign of God's absence. Well, some of you have probably heard the story of Moses' childhood. You see, this Pharaoh who had enslaved the Hebrew people because he did not remember who Joseph was, began to grow shocked at how the Hebrew people were prospering in spite of their oppression. And so he orders a genocide. He orders his troops to kill all of the Hebrew baby boys. There's a terrible story. And then Moses' mother has this young baby who is a strong and healthy baby, and she decides to hide the baby as long as she can, as all the mothers must have done. And when the boy was too big to be hidden any longer, she took a basket and she covered it with tar to waterproof it, and she put it in some bulrushes on the banks of the Nile River. And then while Moses' sister Miriam was watching at a distance, the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter, came down to have a bath. And she stumbled upon this basket with the baby inside it. And then Miriam, Moses' sister, arrived at just the right time and struck a deal with the princess that later on the boy would become the princess's own son, but in the meantime the boy would be taken back to his own mother, who would raise him, and the princess would even pay her a wage for looking after her own son. Well, our episode today began with the report that Moses had since grown up and he was a man. And one day Moses went out to see his Hebrew people at work, and he noticed one of the Egyptians abusing a Hebrew slave. And he flew into a rage, and he looked to the left and he looked to the right, and he saw that no one was looking, And he laid a beating on that Egyptian, and he killed him. He took the body and buried it in the sand. And then as soon as he found out that it was not a secret and the people knew what he had done and that his own life was in danger, that he was liable to be punished for his crime, he fled into the wilderness of Midian. And then he settled down, he had a family, he became a shepherd, he established a life for himself. And later on in the story, we'll find that it is Moses whom God has called to return to Egypt and to lead the Hebrew people out of their slavery. It is amazing that this person who was a killer became the instrument of God. He was the one God called to lead his people to salvation. And we find throughout the story of the Bible that God uses people who are very normal, and at times even people who are deeply flawed. All of you will know the name of Martin Luther King Jr. In the 1950s and 1960s, of course, he was that great leader for civil rights in America, particularly in the southern United States. He gave many, many powerful speeches that influenced lots of people, and he organized rallies and marches and boycotts and all kinds of things which basically led to the end of segregation between blacks and whites in America. Martin Luther King Jr. was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, perhaps the highest award human can get in today's world. Now, many people don't realize that Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian minister. He is widely regarded today as one of the greatest Christian preachers of all time. And not only that, he had a PhD in Christian theology. People read his writings today and realize what a sophisticated theologian he was, and what a brilliant man and thinker, what a great articulator of the Christian faith. There are statues of Martin Luther King Jr. carved on the walls of famous churches around the world. What many people don't realize is that Martin Luther King Jr. was unfortunately a serial adulterer. You see, the FBI at the time was very suspicious of his activities. They did not support his civil rights agenda, and so they spied on him. Because he was under surveillance, they realized that he was having all kinds of extramarital affairs. In that regard, he was probably only one step above Tiger Woods morally. And yet, so we have this paradox. We have this great leader accomplishing great things, one through whom God is working, and yet somebody with a deeply flawed character who has an area of his life which is completely out of control. We find in this news for all of us that God intends to work through us, regardless of how imperfect we may be. It's not that it doesn't matter how we behave. It's not that our actions are without consequence, but that we cannot use our flaws and our imperfections as an excuse to step away from the service of God. I had a professor once who I think put this very well. He said, God doesn't wait till we're perfect to use us. And surely we ought to strive for excellence and perfection in our lives and in our faith, and to conduct ourselves according to God's will to the best of our abilities. But in the process of so doing, we can become powerful agents for God's saving transformation in the world. Well, sometime prior to God's call of Moses to return to Egypt in order that he might confront Pharaoh and lead the Hebrew people out of their slavery, we find that as Moses has been leading this life of a shepherd and a family man, that yet a new Pharaoh has arisen in Egypt. And this Pharaoh is the worst of all. He is mistreating the slaves even more than they have been mistreated in the past. And their suffering has grown even worse. And we find at this time the cries of the Hebrews are going up to God. And the Exodus writer tells us simply that God knew. It's a beautifully rich and open-ended phrase. God knew. God knew what was going on. God knew what the Hebrew people were experiencing. God knew that now was the time to act. Of course, that is a mystery to us as well. Why is it only then that God would choose to intervene? Why did God not rescue the Hebrew people from their slavery sooner? Surely it was within the power of the God of the universe to do so, we must think. And yet, as we all know, God's timing is not our timing. Though God's time does intersect with our time. Another great hero of the Christian faith in the past was William Wilberforce. He was a British parliamentarian who was very key in the movement in Britain to bring an end to slavery throughout the British Empire. Wilberforce was first elected to the House of Commons in 1784. And shortly after his election, he converted to the Christian faith. It's very interesting to note that his newfound faith in God became his primary motivator for wanting to see an end to slavery. And so for 40 years, he was in Parliament fighting for the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire. He sat in the House of Commons until 1825. That's 41 years in total. And yet, despite all that effort and all that campaigning, Wilberforce did not see the passing of the Abolition Act. In fact, it was not till some years later, in 1833, just a few days before Wilberforce's death, coincidentally, that the Abolition Act was passed. What a great moment in history. And you'd imagine what it may have been like to experience that campaign. If you were Wilberforce, you would certainly ask, God, why is this taking so long? We might look back and ask the same thing. God, why did that need to take so long? Think about all the human suffering in the interim period. God, you had your man in Parliament as early as 1784. Why only in 1833 was the law passed? This is a question we simply are not able to answer, because God's timing is not our timing. And our wisdom is not God's wisdom. Some of you have heard me tell before the story of Corrie Ten Boom, who was a Dutch watchmaker in the last century. And she did many significant and wonderful things in her life. And one of the favorite stories I have of her writing is of a time when she was a little girl, and her father was a watchmaker, and every Monday he would go by train into Amsterdam and go to the national clock and set his watch by the most precise time available, and then take the train back to his shop and make sure all the watches and clocks were set to the right time. Now, when Corrie was a very little girl, before she started school, she would ride the train into Amsterdam with her father and then ride back. And she writes that one time when she was a little girl, she was getting ready for bed one night, and then this terrible fear overcame her, this kind of fear that children sometimes have of the mortality of their parents. And she wondered, what would she ever do if something were to happen to her parents? She loved her parents so much. They were her entire world. The thought of losing them someday was just too much to bear for a child. And her father came to tuck her in that night, and she told her father of what she was thinking and fearing. And then he told her a little parable. He said, Corrie, when we take the train into Amsterdam, when is it that I give you your ticket? And she said, Daddy, you give me my ticket on the platform just before it's time to get on the train. And he said to her, that's exactly right. And you know, God will give us the faith we need just in time for when we need it. What a wonderful lesson that is. Doubtless for each of us, there are things that will come in our futures which are very difficult, and we have a hard time now imagining how we will live through it, how our faith will be able to withstand it. And yet in our faith today, we can look forward to a future when God will provide the faith we need when we need it. And if this is true, the reverse is also true. That sometimes we need our faith in the future, and that is when God will give it. Sometimes we need our faith now. Sometimes it is in this moment that we are enduring something particularly difficult. We are experiencing something we do not understand, something for which we cannot imagine a productive, divine purpose. And so if that is the case, it is now that God is providing the faith that we need. The story of Exodus, which we'll read over the next few weeks, is a wonderful one with many messages of God's grace. But this one message will run throughout. If we are God's people, God has a plan and a purpose for us. Thanks be to God. Amen.